The rain fell like whispers against the hospital windows that night, the kind of soft drizzle that carries memories. I remember the beeping of machines, the sterile scent of disinfectant, and the feeling of being caught somewhere between life and loss. That was the night I nearly died, years ago. I had been a broken man, literally and emotionally, after a car accident that shattered not just my ribs, but everything I believed about control, purpose, and faith. When I woke up, I didn't remember much except the sound of a gentle voice reading something softly near my bed. A woman's voice, steady, kind, almost like it had been borrowed from heaven itself. I didn't know her name back then, but her presence was like warmth in the middle of all that pain. Before I tell you what happened when I met her again, years later, take a moment, if you believe in kindness, in miracles, or in the power of second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. Because this story changed me forever. I had been 28 when the accident happened, a reckless night, a speeding car, and a moment of carelessness that left me broken in a ditch. I had been on my way home after signing divorce papers, my marriage of 4 years ending in silence and blame. My father had passed away the year before, my business was collapsing, and my mother barely spoke to me. In every sense of the word, I was alone. When the crash happened, part of me didn't even care if I survived. They told me later that it took over 3 hours to get me out of the wreckage. I had multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and was in a coma for nearly 2 weeks. And during that time, there was one nurse who refused to give up on me. She wasn't the kind who just checked vitals and left. The other staff used to whisper about her dedication, how she'd talk to unconscious patients, hum old songs during night shifts, and sometimes bring flowers from her own garden to place by the window. I didn't know any of that then. All I knew was that every time I slipped into that gray space between dreaming and dying, I heard her voice, steady, calm, and full of something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. When I finally woke up, it took days before I could move without pain. My body felt like it belonged to someone else. But what struck me most was how she looked at me, not like a case, not like a patient, but like a person trying to find his way back from the edge. Her name was Clara, and she had eyes that seemed to understand everything without you saying a word. She talked to me every day, sometimes about my progress, sometimes about her garden, sometimes about nothing at all. She had a way of making silence comfortable. There were nights when I woke up in pain, panicking, and she'd be there, adjusting my oxygen mask, whispering, "You're doing fine. Just breathe." When I was finally discharged after 3 months, I thanked her the best I could, but words felt too small. I promised myself I'd come back to visit, to show her I made something of my second chance. But life, it got in the way. Years passed. I rebuilt my life piece by piece. I started a small business again, one that finally began to succeed. I reconnected with my mother. I even started helping out at rehabilitation centers, talking to people who'd lost their hope like I once had. But no matter how much changed, I never forgot Clara, the nurse who never treated me like a burden, who saw the man inside the broken body. Then one afternoon, 5 years later, I found myself walking into the very same hospital, not as a patient this time, but as a donor. My company had done well, and I wanted to give back. I'd arranged to meet with the management to discuss funding new patient care units. But as I walked through the familiar halls, something inside me shifted. The scent, the lighting, even the faint echoes of hurried footsteps brought everything back. And that's when I saw her. She was at the far end of the corridor, sitting beside a wheelchair, speaking gently to an elderly man. Her hair had streaks of gray now, tied in a loose bun, and she wore the same calm expression I remembered. For a moment, time folded in on itself. I wasn't the businessman or the guest donor, I was the broken man in room 302 who had once clung to her voice to stay alive. I walked closer, unsure if she'd recognize me. When she turned and our eyes met, something flickered in hers. Surprise, then recognition, then a warmth so pure it made my throat tighten. She stood up slowly and whispered, "You're here." I nodded, speechless. She looked at me for a long moment before smiling, that same quiet smile I'd never forgotten, and said, "You were my favorite patient." Those words, they hit harder than any storm. Not because they sounded flattering, but because they carried a truth I could feel deep in my chest. I realized, in that instant, that maybe I hadn't just been her patient, I had been part of her own story too. We sat down in the hospital cafe, and I finally learned what I had never known. Clara had been a nurse for over 25 years. She'd lost her husband to cancer a few years before my accident and had a daughter who was studying medicine abroad. She told me that during that dark period of her life, taking care of patients like me gave her something to hold on to, a reason to keep believing that healing was still possible, even when it wasn't her own. She said that every time she saw someone fight to live, it reminded her that life still had meaning. And she remembered me because, as she put it, you were one of the few who came back fighting. I wanted to tell her how much she had done for me, how her small acts of kindness had changed everything. But before I could, she laughed softly and said, "You already did. You lived." That line stayed with me. Because she was right. The best way to repay those who save us isn't through gifts or words. It's by living a life that honors their care. We spent hours talking. I told her about the donation, and she thanked me not as a hospital representative, but as someone who understood why I was doing it. She said, "You're closing a circle, aren't you?" I nodded. It felt like that. But fate wasn't done teaching me yet. A few months later, I got a call from the hospital director. Clara had been diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. She was still working despite the treatments, still smiling, still caring for others even as she fought her own battle. I visited her often during her chemotherapy sessions. She never complained, never let bitterness in. "Every sunrise," she said once, "is proof that there's still something left to be grateful for." When her health worsened, I helped arrange for her room to have the same kind of window view she used to give her patients, sunlight, a few plants, and a soft chair by the bed. I visited every evening, reading aloud sometimes, just like she once did for me. She'd smile weakly and say, "Now the roles are reversed." There came a day when she was too weak to talk much. She just looked at me and whispered, "Promise me something." I leaned closer. She said, "Don't stop believing in people. Even when they hurt you, even when they leave. Someone believed in you once, and look how far you've come." She passed away 3 weeks later, peacefully, with her daughter by her side. At her funeral, I saw dozens of faces. Former patients, fellow nurses, families, each carrying a story of how Clara had touched their lives. There were tears, yes, but also gratitude. So much gratitude. I stood there, looking at her photograph framed with white lilies, and realized something I hadn't before. Sometimes, angels don't come with wings. They come with stethoscopes, gentle hands, and voices that remind you to breathe when you've forgotten how. In her honor, I established a foundation under her name, the Clara Hope Initiative, to provide emotional support and resources for nurses and long-term patients. We made sure her favorite flowers, lavender and jasmine, were planted in every new hospital wing we helped fund. And every time I visit one of those hospitals, I see someone sitting by a bed, whispering hope into a room full of pain, and I think of her. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Sometimes a small act of kindness, a gentle word, or a few moments of compassion can change someone's entire life, and you never know, you might be someone's favorite patient too, in ways you'll only understand years later. Sparkle special request, tell me in the comments, have you ever met someone who changed your life with kindness? I'd love to read your stories. Because in the end, it's not the grand gestures that stay with us. It's the quiet ones. The nurse who held your hand when you were scared, the stranger who smiled when you needed it most, the person who made you believe again when you'd stopped trying. Clara did that for me. And maybe, through this story, she can do that for you too.